rather than tell or talk about a problem, what I've become really fond of is little mini exercises you can do with them that illuminate the problems.
Ever wondered why some reps close deals with ease while others struggle? In the next 20 minutes, Jen Allen, who's trained over 1,000 sales professionals, will reveal the meeting secrets that separate the top 1% from the rest. Prepare to never run an average meeting again. And that's why we're starting this series with Calendly called Meeting Momentum, Winning Strategies for Sales, on how sales professionals can learn from other sales professionals on how to be better and what buyers are thinking about while you're in the sales process. So let's dive into the conversation. With everything, we always like to start off with a fun question. So, Jen, when you are in a meeting, what is something that people do or someone has done that made the meeting even more exciting that you love to see?
Oh, I thought you were going to go the opposite direction. I was going to talk about someone who was eating chicken fingers. So let's see. Something that has made it more exciting. Oh, I've got one. When someone does the visual whiteboarding, I can't say I've ever done it. Keith Whiteman is someone on LinkedIn that I follow who I think does such a cool job of talking about it. But I do think that is like a totally underused tactic to get someone to feel less like they're sitting in a presentation.
Wait, what about the chicken fingers? Like, chicken fingers are great. Why are you hating on them?
In a meeting, someone was eating chicken fingers and then licking their fingers. And I was like watching.
No way. On a sales call?
On a sales call. I was the seller and they were on the customer side. And there were, 4 or 5 people on it. They weren't the main one talking, but whether or not you're the main one talking, I don't know if licking your fingers at a meeting is ever an appropriate call. So that just stood out to me.
Jen, I know you probably have trained or over 1,000 people. It's probably more than that at this point, probably 10,000, maybe 1 million people. My numbers might be off, so you can correct me. But
it's 1 million. It just keeps getting bigger.
It's, I don't know, like every day it just continuously add. So what I want to get an understanding is, like, could you tell me about your journey on how you got better at running meetings and making them impactful, and maybe some improvements that you've made in the past couple of years that could help sellers right now?
Oh, I want to own up to the fact that I sucked at running meetings for a very long time. Like, I think I was probably the last laggard in the world to accept that you have to turn on video on a Zoom call. I really held out for a very long time, mostly because I didn't want to take the time to do my makeup and my hair. And so that was a personal barrier for me. I think the thing that I messed up before and learned to get over was I was so concerned about my side of the street, meaning like I would be the person that had the script and here's how every minute of the call is going to go. And here's all my beautiful slides that I spent way too much time building. And so when I got on the call, my nerves took over and I just defaulted to talking and presenting. And you could watch how quickly people would just tune out of that, because in our personal lives, in our business life, like none of us really enjoys standing and being on the other end of a presentation. And so honestly, I think the thing it was I started looking at what was happening to my call conversion, meaning after a first call, what tended to happen. And I got to a point, I forget what year it was, but I got to a point where almost all of my first calls did not convert to second. And I was like, all right, that's on me, because someone was interested enough to take a call and then now all of a sudden they're completely uninterested. Sure, that's going to happen time after time, but not to the vast majority. And so what I learned was to kind of pull away from the crutch of having slides, pull away from this idea that the call is going to go the way that I want to go, and instead think of it like a choreography. Like, here are the big stages I think need to happen in a call, but start thinking about if-then moments. But if the person says this, or if they object to this, then where do I route it? And that's what helped me, I think, become a little bit more engaging in the conversation.
Choreography, were you dancing on these calls?
I mean, I always dance, Morgan. Just like life is a party, you got to keep dancing.
I was like, all right, like if that's what you're doing, fair play. Okay, so you mentioned that these if and then statements, maybe it's more than 3, but could you give us like 3 examples of how you prepared before the call and how it helps you on the call to increase like your close rate overall as a seller?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of kind of discovery before the discovery call. So I don't think in this day and age we should ever be showing up to calls being like, so what do you do? And what do you sell? And what's hard? Like, we should come to the call with some sort of idea. loosely held, right? And that I think is the important part, is that my job in the call is not to prove that I'm right or prove that I did all my research. It's just to spark a conversation. And so an example of an if-then would be if I'm looking at a company and let's say they're in the manufacturing space, right? And I'm looking at what are the new products that they're releasing this year. I'm going to make some sort of an estimated guess around, hey, if I see a lot of the products are services-based versus product-based, I'm going to come to that call with a hypothesis that maybe it might be hard for their sellers to shift from selling a product to a service. And so I'll start the call and say, listen, when I was looking at, the earnings from last quarter, I noticed there seemed to be this theme around rolling out a bunch of services instead of products. I might be totally off here, but is that something that's intentional? Is that something where you're asking your sellers to add on more services revenue? And then I shut up. And I think in an if-then moment, it could be no, it just so happened that there were these services. It could be yes, and actually there's this big issue that we're having because sellers can't demo anything because the service isn't untouchable. And so I'm preparing for, if it's not that, I've got to have a backup. Or if it is that, but they're all set on that problem, I've got to have a different angle. I think what I used to do was just go in with one idea and pray to God I'd be right in the call, and often wasn't.
And I feel like that's what a lot of sellers, they'll do. They'll show up on the call and say like, oh, I hope it's going to work out. And then it doesn't end up working out, right? So what do you feel like, you mentioned a couple of things, but what separates like the top, but you train a lot of people here too, right? So from what you're now doing, training and coaching teams, what are the top sales reps doing that the other reps aren't?
So one is they're balancing their talk listen time. I'm not a big fan of like, it has to be a specific percentage. I know there's some stats out there. I think when you overthink it to that extent, you end up kind of having a really just goofy conversation. So I think great sellers know how to spark a dialogue from someone else. So specifically, within the first 3 minutes, if that other person has not started talking extensively, I know that I've done my job wrong. I'm the one that's supposed to give them fodder to react to. And I think if you listen to the first 5 minutes of any seller's call, you can tell very quickly as to where that outcome of that call was probably going to be. Like, I think you could probably put money on it and guess where it is. So I think that's one, is they're very effective at getting the other person on the call to talk as much or if not more than they are. Number two, I think they're great about not relying on a crutch. Like, I think when you look at a conversation, it's either going to be a discussion or a presentation. I was making the mistake of too often just viewing every call as a presentation. But I think discovery, first calls, like those should be much more of a discussion. So I think what you find with great sellers is you can give them no crutches and they're just as effective as when they have a set of slides or slide decks to run through. So that's number two. And then number three, I think they do a really good job of just being someone you enjoy talking to. So the other place where I got in my head was I felt like I had to be a certain way on a call to sound like the way I was supposed to sound. And so I wasn't funny. I wasn't memorable. And I think for many reasons, right, it was just easy to forget what that conversation even was. So when I started paying attention to how other really great sellers were leading calls, what I realized is like they were actually quite likable. Not that their desire was to be likable, but they were just very human and they saw an opportunity to make a joke. They'd make a joke. It's just not that deep. And sometimes I think I was overthinking it.
I think those are really good call outs. And, you know, I feel like when most people, when they go into meetings, they overthink it or they'll make it bigger than what it is. And then they actually aren't able to perform at the level that they need to, right? Which leads to all different types of conversations that you don't want to go into. So I feel like one thing you talked about though is the talk time. I know some people are like, oh, I can only talk 10%. It sounds, this might be creepy though. Only talking 10%. Like you can
just one word answers.
Like just that, say like, great. And then ask a question, then like open up from there. But in all seriousness, you talked about obviously asking great questions. So could you give some guidance on how do you ask great questions? And then how do you remain focused in the meeting so that you can do that well?
Yeah. So I think coming up with great questions on the fly is hard. I'm not going to say if someone says something and it sparks an idea, you shouldn't go that direction. I think that's like part of leading a good conversation is your ability to be agile. But for me, what made it easier for me was I would start to look back at all of the conversations I had. I would say, what were the best conversations? What made them the best? And almost always it was one question where the prospect sat back in their chair and they were like, wow, I never thought about it that way. And I think that became my obsession, is how do I manufacture one of those moments in a call? And so often the way that I would get to that is by starting with an observation about them. I saw your business doing this. I read about your business doing this, which got me thinking maybe it's because of this, but I'm wondering, what about this? And like, you could take that template and fill in the blank, no matter what you sell, who you're selling it to, any of that stuff. And I think that is my goal, is not to get someone to say, yeah, that's a great question, but someone to literally sit back in their chair and say, okay, yeah, that's a different way of thinking about it that I never saw. So I think in the beginning, I probably overestimated how many of those moments you need in a call. I don't think we actually need that many. I think we just want to show the buyer, the prospect, the person at the end of the call, that we've done research on them and we're coming with questions that are not just universal questions we're asking everybody. They're specific to their situation.
Based on that one question, are you writing that question beforehand, like you said, because it's not on the fly? So like, you kind of give an example of that, but is there like a go-to exact question you have, or is it just framework based and you have to apply it based on your market and industry?
My go-to questions are usually keeping status quo in mind. So to be specific, our biggest competition usually in sales is just the customer being like, yeah, I could change, or I could just stay the same, right? Like the house isn't on fire. I could keep going how we're going. And so one of the questions that I'm seeking to understand is to understand, why might they want to stay the same? Because in a sales call, the buyer expects us to sell them on change. We expect ourselves to sell them on change. So I like questions that kind of interrupt that and back them up to say, okay, sure, we could talk about what the solution would look like. We could talk about all the great things that'll happen. But out of curiosity, like, what happens if you don't change? What happens if nothing changes? And I think that's one of those questions where you get the person, you start seeing the person thinking honestly and talking honestly. And that's another, I think, critical moment in a meeting, is you want to break through that fourth wall of like, I'm a vendor and you're a customer. I want to have that moment where they start to think out loud and say things that salespeople don't typically like to hear. So that question about like, why do anything at all, probably is a question, if I think back about all my call recordings, if I didn't ask it, I would think like, Jen, what were you doing? You missed out.
Yeah. I asked the same question. I think it's hard for sellers to ask that, because like, if it's just like, nah, nothing, you're kind of stuck. But it's the question that you do need to ask.
I'd much rather know it now. I'd much rather not do all the work, create the proposal, bring everybody on, and then have to find that answer out. So yeah, I think.
Yep.
Or optimizing.
Not what we wanted at all. I think that's a good point. And then another thing is, when you're in these meetings, we're obviously on video right now. How important is it for sellers to be on video in a virtual meeting, and then also their buyers on video?
I totally undervalued this in the beginning. Like I said, I was dragging my feet in 2020 when they were like, you got to turn your video on, Jen. I was like, fine. I missed out, I am sure, on so many physical cues. I think the biggest one is watching when someone starts tuning out. Like, you can watch their eye movements and they start going down here and, looking around. That's a place where I know I need to interrupt that and just call out the elephant in the room. If I can't see their face and they can't see mine, I can't see when that's happening. So I might think I'm on like the run of a lifetime and I'm tearing up this great insight. And meanwhile, they're checking like their J. Crew order to see if it's coming on time.
J. Crew? Why are we hating on J. Crew? Like, we're just trying to.
I don't know. I don't even shop at J. Crew. I don't even know where that came from.
We're just trying to drip. I don't know why you're doing that J. Crew.
So I think that's a big thing, is being able to measure someone's attention span, where they're going. But I also think there is something to having that exchange in the beginning. Like, I'm terrible at this. My background is a picture of my wedding and then 3 pictures of my dog. You've got a really cool background, right? And it's like, it gives you more to talk about than the weather. It gives you a signal into what someone might care about. I find that buyers often have stuff in their background, and you can make an easier connection if you do want to do small talk in the beginning. It's just easier than just looking at a black box.
Yeah.
But I think you also have to give them a reason to come on camera. Like, if they're not on camera and you start and you're not on camera and you just stay there, that's weird. But if you come on camera and you say, hey, I'm going to be on camera today, like, up to you. It's, if you want to stay on or off, that's okay. But if you're engaging, I think it's just naturally going to make them feel odd if they don't come on camera too. So I think I definitely overthought it, for sure.
To your point, when you're on camera and your buyers on camera, you can see all the little things that you may have missed. That I've noticed that big time. Like I was like, oh, wait, this person did that. They did this. That's interesting. Like, let me call that out. Let me do this. So you just look at things from a completely different perspective. And so I encourage everyone to like, not only turn your videos on, do exactly what Jen said to bring people on the video, which obviously is key. Now, you have a good meeting. We talked about questions, how you go about it. We talked about what you do before. What are you doing after the meeting to make sure that you're staying engaged with the buyer? Like, what are you telling sellers to do? Because I feel like this is where most people go wrong. They just send like a generic follow-up. People don't care, or they don't send any follow-ups. Like, what do you do here?
So again, I'll throw myself under the bus. I think I definitely fell into the camp where I would just like not do follow-up, or I'd send follow-up and it would be 18 pages long. And that sucks. I don't want to write it.
Sending a scroll of
they don't want to read it because I wouldn't be like, look, I paid attention. Well, I'm such a good student. And so now what I do is I give myself like a 15-minute block in between calls, and I force myself to get the note out. And that note could be one of two things. It could be quick, here's the thing that we need to discuss, or here's the next step. And it's short and it's punchy, and it's not a sermon of thank you so much for your time and I loved all of our it's none of that. Nobody needs to read that. It's just punchy and it's to the point. Or I send a note and say, what I'm going to send is going to take me a few hours to pull together. So expect to hear from me by at whatever. I don't think people have this immediacy of they need our follow-up right now. I think where prospects get frustrated is when we don't communicate. And I've certainly messed that up. And so if I know I can't get it done in that 15-minute window, I'm specific, because it's as much for them as it is for me. Like, I need a deadline to know when I'm held accountable. So I'll drop a, just a calendar invite on my own calendar and say, this goes out by this time, this day. And that keeps me accountable for staying true to deadlines. And then the last thing I would say is like, the PS is an awesome place in an email. You and I both use it. PS is where I'll try to drop some human piece of like, and by the way, like, enjoy your trip to Napa, like something that shows I was paying attention for more than just a business outcome. And it also gives me an opportunity on the email above it, if I don't hear from them, to be like, oh, by the way, how was that game? How was that trip? So it humanizes the outreach a little bit more.
This buyer sounds great. They're shopping at J. Crew and then also going to Napa. Like,
I'm just
having a good time.
Ideal buyer in my mind. Waiting to meet you. Please call.
Are you doing anything beyond just, I actually like the 15-minute block. Do you feel, actually, this is a devil's advocate here, because I think a lot of people will say, well, Jen, I want back-to-back meetings to save more time. Have you been that person that's a back-to-back meeting? I have it as well. And have you found that the 15-minute block actually makes you more productive because you actually get the things done?
Oh, 100%. I think we too often celebrate this idea of being busy, and I've got back-to-back calls and look at my calendar like, cool, dude. But if you're not being thoughtful as follow-up to the call, I would almost say just cancel the call, because so much of the work happens after the call. It's what you do after that first conversation. And so if you don't allow yourself enough time to provide a thoughtful follow-up, they're going to forget about us. Like, it sucks to say, but it's the truth. They're just in way too many meetings. And so I would rather push a call out by a day than back to back my calendar and make it so that I'm rushing from call to call being like, who is this person? And what does this company sell? And what am I going to send them after in 6 days from now?
I know that you're going to have a gym here for everybody.
Oh, don't say that, because now I feel pressure. That's the worst thing you can say.
I already know. No, I already know. I'm already telling the people what's going to happen. So they're prepared. I want to make sure that they get their notes out and they take note of this. And they need to be prepped appropriately. We just talked about prep. I'm just using what you're saying. So I'm just trying to prep accordingly. Okay, so you have been in a lot of conversations with sales teams. You have gone on site with a lot of sales teams. You have previous experience in selling, sales training, and coaching. And so my question to you is, right now, in today's crowded environment, let's say in the past 6 months, what's been something in a meeting, you said what you have seen before, not chicken fingers here, but what have you done in a meeting recently that made you stand out amongst the competition that you would encourage people to test and try that might make them feel uncomfortable, but it actually does work?
Oh, okay. I love this question. I'm actually glad you asked it. I think we have a tendency to talk and tell when we get into a group meeting setting, right? So imagine you're selling something, you have a champion, they bring you in front of a larger team. You're like, all right, now I got to pitch. I actually think in those meetings, one of the things I am very intentional about doing well, it's two things. One, I center it around problem, not solution. They expect to see a salesperson show up and talk about a solution. They don't expect to hear a sales rep come in and talk about the problem and give them ideas and insights that have nothing to do with the solution. They just don't expect it. So I like unexpected moments. But two, rather than tell or talk about a problem, what I've become really fond of is little mini exercises you can do with them that illuminate the problem. So one example of that I just started doing, well, there's two, but I'll give you the one that I used to do because it's faster, is like one of the things I train and teach about is how do you sell effectively when you've got multiple different people in the buying group. Now I could sit there and read the stats and I could talk about the problem. I could get nodding heads, but instead what I do is I say, listen, for the sake of example, I'm going to have us all pretend that I'm ordering you a pizza. We're all in the same room. You're going to get a pizza. And on that pizza, you get to have one topping. I don't care what it is, but you all have to agree with the topping is. So let's go one by one. All 7 people in the room. What's your one topping? And it is so fun, one, because it gets them talking and make sure every single person talks. But it's this humanizing moment where you inevitably get someone who's like ride or die for pineapple, fighting with the person for pizza. And instead of talking about the problem of selling to buying groups, you're creating that moment. And it's like, man, we're sitting here arguing. At the end of the day, we're still getting a free pizza. And look at the way we're arguing, which is no different than what your sellers are up against in their deals. And so what I found is when I do that, one, it pulls people in, it makes it a memorable moment, but it also illuminates the concept better than if I just sat there and described it in a really stale, forgettable way. So that's one thing.
I love that. So all sellers, again, like I said, it was going to be a gym. I don't know why you repeated. I don't know what was going on.
Got me nervous.
You shouldn't be, because we already knew it was going to be a gym. That's why I told people. So now they took notes and now they feel equipped and they're prepared to go take action. So you brought us through all the different stuff that's happening across the board on how to run effective meetings, how sellers can literally take this right now. As we wrap up, is there something that you're seeing with sales reps right now that you're like, hey, if y'all could just improve this one thing that you're seeing that, maybe a mistake that they're making, if you improve this one thing right now, that could fundamentally change the way that they sell and help them with close rates, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah. Have a story to tell in your meeting about the flaws of current state. I think we have a tendency to rush things in our sales process because we think the faster I can show the solution, the faster they're going to be wowed, the faster I get that contract. And it's, in my opinion, completely the opposite. We are up against so much competition for budget that we are thinking about how do I show them that we're the best? What we're often not thinking about is what else are we in competition with, not just in our industry or in our category, but outside of our category. What are other ways that they might solve a problem? And so I think we really are at the point now where if we cannot have an effective conversation there, we better hope and pray we got the best product at the cheapest price with the brand that they want. And that is outside of my control. So definitely spend more time validating and building the problem state and less time trying to hope your solution will carry you through.
Awesome. Well, Jen, thank you so much for your time with so much valuable insight. I hope everyone walks away feeling more empowered as a seller to run more effective meetings. If they can find you, I'm assuming it's on LinkedIn, Demand Jen, which every time I say it out loud, I don't know how she got so fortunate. It's such an incredible name. But I mean, it's just for you, though. It is awesome to hear that. So
thank you.
Definitely go check her out. It's just amazing content. Appreciate y'all tuning in to the Master Meetings, and we'll see you on the next one.